Every 45 seconds or so, oystermen plunge their long-handled tongs into the shallow blue-gray waters of Apalachicola Bay, rake the bottom and deposit meager-looking piles on the bow of their flat-bottomed boat. A gloved co-worker calls the keepers from the empty shells and immature oysters, which are tossed back. "See these guys here?" asked Shannon Hartsfield, whose family has fished and oystered and crabbed and shrimped here for 4 generations. He pointed to a nearby boat. 3 tongers and 1 color? Usually you'd have 1 tonger and 2 or 3 colors. That's the flip-flop used to, that man right there'd keep 2 colors busy all day long. Apalachicola Bay, an estuary recognized by the United Nations for its uniqueness, once produced 10% of the nation's oysters and 90% of those from Florida. Why it doesn't anymore, why its oyster production has fallen so dramatically, has been the subject of decades of litigation, which now has landed before the Supreme Court. Florida v. Georgia, which is to be argued Monday, is a water fight that pits the thirsty megalopolis of Atlanta and the farmers of southeastern Georgia against conservationists and seafood producers in this stretch of the Florida Panhandle called the Forgotten Coast. Both states need the fresh water that starts in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, as well as in a spring just south of the Atlanta airport, and meanders hundreds of miles before finding its way into the Gulf of Mexico via the Apalachicola River. So far, Georgia has been the big winner, aided by decisions from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that allow it to keep the lion's share of the water. Often in such Supreme Court fights, each state wants water for growth. But in Apalachicola, leaders say getting a greater share is necessary to allow the place to stay as it is. The fresh water provides the perfect degree of bay salinity required to sustain the seafood industry, they say, and thus a way of life. Rural Franklin County has as much coastline as the state of Alabama, but fewer than 12,000 residents, and only 1 traffic light that changes color, said County Commissioner Joseph Smokey Parrish. There's no theme parks, there's no movie theaters, there's no shopping malls. There's no 10-story condominiums, said Parrish, whose day job is overseeing the processing of shrimp at Buddy Ward and Sons Seafood in the town of Apalachicola. Everybody who comes here says, "Man, keep it just the way you have it." Dan Tunsmeyer of the conservation group Apalachicola Riverkeeper noted that the area's significance has received international, national and state accolades. If state and local officials in Florida have often squandered its natural resources in the name of growth, they've done the opposite here, he said. You can't come up with an area that has more designations of its ecological importance, Tunsmeyer said. And we're going to lose it, knowingly. That's what's at stake here for the Supreme Court. The legal fight has been raging for 3 decades. Florida has spent nearly $57 million in legal fees on the current lawsuit alone. Georgia has spent upward of $40 million and says it is time for the Supreme Court to end the fight.